Thanks so much, Scott and Lauren, for sharing your garden with us, two of my favorite gardening folks. And now I'm going to be joined by another of my favorite gardening folks, Chris Wiesinger. Thank you so much for being back to Central Texas Gardener.
Tom, I'm always excited, so thanks for having me.
Well, for those who don't know Chris, he's been a regular guest on the show for the past few years. He is the proprietor of the Southern Bulb Company, collector of heirloom bulbs from throughout the South. Find the right bulbs for us in this very tough climate.
Right, and been influenced by folks like Scott Ogden, so how exciting. Very heavily influenced.
Right.
Absolutely.
And this year is a big year for you. Not only is the business really moving quickly for you, but you're celebrating a release of a book, which we're going to be talking about, Heirloom Bulbs for Today.
Absolutely, yeah. And, you know, we go over some of the major superstars that you find. It's definitely not all-inclusive. But
Right. Well, you know, we've talked a lot in the past about a lot of the fall-blooming bulbs, things like the lycoris and the oxblood lilies, but we're going to try to mix it up a little bit this year.
Right.
But before we do, let's talk about the impact of this weather on the bulbs we're going to be discussing.
Sure. I mean, you know, crinums are surviving this year. And we think,
okay, well, let's just pull this. I think we know why this would survive, just the scale of it.
Exactly. It has enough to dry down, enough leaves to sort of cover it. And they're tough bulbs. And
I love the crinums.
Yeah, crinums are a lot of fun. They don't look like much, but when they bloom, they're spectacular when they bloom at 100 degrees.
Yeah, right.
And it's really hot. And we, you know, and down here in Austin, when we think about bulbs, we think about some of those that bloom in the fall. But, you know, we can enjoy those, but as those bloom, we realize the seasonality of things, and the hot weather will be over.
Right.
And we'll move to some other bulbs.
Right. And spring, that's what everybody really thinks about when they think of bulbs, the spring blooming varieties. And we're going to be we're really going to be keying in on those during our conversation today. Before we do talk about particular varieties, so let's give folks an idea of how to prepare a good home for bulbs here in this in these tough conditions that we have in Central Texas.
Right, right. And one thing I've come to realize is just because we see these bulbs do well on old home sites, that doesn't mean, like I used to think maybe when I was younger, you could just take any of these bulbs and just plop them down in dry, hard rock soil and that they would survive. It takes a little bit of prep. You know, a lot of those old home sites had prepped soil. And so one of the things you want to definitely make sure you do is mix in enough organic matter to where there's some moisture retention in there if it's just awful, awful soil.
Right. Drainage, I always think of drainage when I think of bulbs as well. Any kind of rock mineral content?
You can. It's definitely important that a lot of the bulbs aren't in standing water. But, you know, beyond that, some of the bulbs are okay, and they're not the best drained soils. In fact, some kind of like it dry, and we'll talk about a couple of those bulbs.
Great. Well, before we turn to the bulbs themselves, I just want people to appreciate a little bit of the work that went into the book. And this, first off, I have to say, it's beautiful.
Thanks.
It's beautifully organized.
Thanks.
I'm very impressed by that. Very readable as well. Tell me your aims for the book.
You know, that's a really great question because it is aimed and geared towards somebody who doesn't really understand what this whole heirloom bulb thing is about. You might see one or two in an old home site blooming. Well, this book says if you're new to it and you're curious about bulbs in Texas and the South, here are the major superstars that you would find. Here's the time of year you'd find them. Here's just some of my stories as I collected them. But here's what you would find if you were to be a bulb hunter and go out. Here are the top, you know, 20, 30 bulbs that you would find in these locations.
And how to use them in your own garden.
And then how to use them in your own garden. We talked about the soil prep, and that is important.
Right.
Good drainage is important for most of them. Don't want them in standing water. Although some like it, we mentioned that. And then you think about the fertilizer needs. You really don't have to fertilize, but I have realized some of the bulbs, especially like the greedy crinums.
They are a little greedy.
Yeah, they are. They will really take up anything you give them. So you want to stay away from a lot of nitrogen. If you think about bulbs, they're very grass-like foliage. They are monocots. You shoot them with too much nitrogen, like you would give a lawn, you'll get a lot of foliage and not a lot of blooms. But if you look at potassium and phosphorus, the last two numbers on that 3 number on the bag ratio, you want higher numbers of those If all you can find is the even, you can do a light dose of that.
Right. Okay. Well, there's some of the basics, and I really do encourage folks to look at the book. You can find that. It's going to be a great addition to your home garden library. But let's talk about some of the superstars that you've been talking about. Now, everybody loves Narcissus.
Right.
I have to say that some of my fondest memories of childhood deal with Narcissus. But what are the best varieties that you've encountered for those of us who live in the South?
Right. And if you're not familiar with what a Narcissus is, when we talk about daffodils, you know, that's a Narcissus, a type of Narcissus.
Right.
But here we're a little more custom to Narcissus because we think about Narcissus bulbs as having a little bit of a smaller bloom. And generally it's these smaller blooming Narcissus or smaller daffodils, multi-flowering, that will do better for us. And when we think about those things, we obviously think about the Tazettas. And a Narcissus Tazetta bulb that everybody thinks about would be a paper white. But if you don't like the smell of a paper white, you can go with those a little more dark yellow in the cup and that bloom later in the year, a little more cold hardy, like the Grand Primos.
It's one of the beautiful plant.
Nice big Narcissus bulbs, bigger than a typical daffodil bulb. Sends up 2 to 3 flower stalks. Think about bulbs like Golden Dawn. That's yellow petals and darker gold cups. Sweet, sweet smell. It'll knock your socks off. Blooms in March.
You know, some people do complain about the paper. I like paper whites too.
I give a lot of talks to garden clubs, and I always ask them, how many of you like the smell of paper whites? And half their hands go up. How many of you don't like the smell of paper whites? And the other half goes up. It is split right down the middle.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but a nice selection there of Narcissus to choose from. And it's one that I'm very excited to talk about is a tulip that you actually use the term Georgetown tulip. I've never heard this before. Tulip praecox, right?
Yeah, well, there's been lots of nicknames. Tulipa praecox. My old professor, Bill Welch, Dr. Bill Welch, calls it the Georgetown tulip. Because when he was a student at Southwestern, he saw a small patch of them blooming in a yard, and he mentioned it to me when I began my bulb hunting adventures almost 8 years ago. And I went back, and half the yard in that little town in Georgetown was full of this red blooming tulip. And so he calls it the Georgetown tulip. Some of us call it the Texas tulip. Because it just does so well in Texas. But it's an early blooming red tulip. It's phototropic, so it's closed in the mornings. But as the sun comes out in the day, it just opens up.
See, that makes it even more special, I think, you know, to see that the cycle of that flower.
Yeah. And it just reminds you about the seasonality of life and the cyclic nature of our own lives. When it opens up, jet black center, lined with a honeybee yellow. And what's best is, you know, I've seen this bulb like you would clumps of daffodils on old home sites in central Texas. I've seen patches of it along old finch rows, just naturalizing on old lots. But it likes it dry in the summertime.
Well, we can supply that.
We've got that taken care of. But that's Tulipa praecox. It's an early blooming red tulip.
Wow, that sounds really exciting. Now, another one that I have to say I'm just really fired up about is a fall blooming crocus.
Well, they call it the fall blooming crocus or autumn daffodil. Sternbergia.
Sternbergia
is the genus name. Sternbergia lutea. It's a very Mediterranean bulb. Which makes you think, sure, around this neck of the woods in Texas it would do well. It is amazing. It's just like the oxblows and the spiders. It's dormant in the summertime, and then when the fall hits, late September, October, buttercup yellow blooms just start popping up, trumpet-shaped blooms. And we've seen them do this just on old empty lots. And dappled shade to full sun, completely dry, no irrigation, and all of a sudden these yellow blooms start popping
put this
up.
Together with the red blooms, the lycoris and the things
and
like
the oxblood lilies, rhodophylla. It's stunning, absolutely stunning in the fall. Supply is a little limited, but kind of harder to find. All over Israel, believe it or not, and it does well here in Austin.
Well, it would make sense in that Middle Eastern dry climate, and real briefly, we only have a few seconds here, but I want to mention one variety of Amaryllis, and I want to talk about Johnson's Amaryllis.
The very first hybrid Amaryllis, 1790. Some folks still say it's the best hybrid Amaryllis, and the hybridization was done by a man named Johnson, English watchmaker. Red with white stripes, very old, pointy-petaled look, blooms in April, smells great. Believe it or not, you plant it in the fall, normally, and it'll kind of grow in the wintertime, but really grows late February, blooms in April with the fragrance, an Amaryllis with the fragrance.
Great.
Knocks your socks off.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, folks can find Chris at southernbulbs.com. I highly recommend that. And again, the new book, Heirloom Bulbs for Today. Congratulations to you and to your co-author, Cherie Colburn.
Yes, Cherie Colburn, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you, Chris. It's always a pleasure to
Thanks,
see
Tom.
you. Best of luck.
Thanks.
And coming up next is our friend Daphne.